Part 1. Day 11092 of the war. Europe's political corridors are humming with anticipation tonight, as European leaders have finally reached an agreement among themselves on how the long-discussed security guarantees for Ukraine should look. At first glance, the framework seems promising, but in international diplomacy, the distance between agreement and action can stretch for months, or even collapse overnight. Now, everyone's eyes are on Washington. The next step is for Donald Trump to sign under these guarantees and, ideally, to exert pressure on Vladimir Putin to accept them as well. That's where the intrigue begins, because if Trump refuses, all these plans may remain only elegant paper statements, not shields against new aggression. Meanwhile, a new and entirely unexpected dimension of the war is unfolding, not on land, but at sea. The Black Sea has long been an arena of confrontation, but what happened recently near Novorossiysk marks a turning point. For the first time, Ukrainian underwater drones reportedly targeted a Russian submarine. Russian military channels rushed to insist that the sub survived, yet even they admit Russia's Black Sea fleet has once again been caught defenseless. Fires continue to rage at Russia's oil and gas infrastructure, and drone attacks now reach deep into the Caspian Sea region, hitting facilities almost daily.
In response, Russia is desperately attempting to fragment Ukraine's energy system into isolated islands. So far, however, this hasn't broken Ukrainian morale. According to a new poll, the majority of Ukrainians remain determined to endure as long as it takes to achieve a just peace. And while the battlefield shifts and the skies roar, a quieter but no less important drama unfolds in the political halls of Europe. Over 2 tense days of talks in Berlin, European and American representatives worked out a joint statement detailing a 6-point vision for Ukraine's future security. The points, though written in diplomatic language, carry profound implications. The first promises sustained large-scale support to maintain Ukraine's armed forces at around 800,000 troops in peacetime, a figure remarkable by European standards. The second proposes a multinational coalition of Ukrainian-aligned forces under European leadership, backed by the United States. These forces would assist in the defense of Ukrainian airspace, maritime security, and even conduct joint operations on Ukrainian territory. The third outlines an international ceasefire monitoring mechanism led by the U.S., ensuring early warning of any future attacks and establishing a system of conflict prevention and rapid response. But perhaps the most striking are points 4 through 6. Legally binding commitments to restore peace and security if Ukraine is attacked again, potentially including the use of military force. Major investment in Ukraine's reconstruction and trade, and an unequivocal endorsement of Ukraine's path toward European Union membership. The signatories list reads like a roll call of Europe's most powerful figures: Scholz, Macron, Meloni, Starmer, von der Leyen, Tusk, Frederiksen, Kristersson, and others. Yet one absence stands out: no American signature. That omission is the quiet heartbeat of this story, the unresolved question that will determine everything that follows. Political analysts have already begun dissecting the statement. The popular political commentator known as Bitili notes that these are still European guarantees, not transatlantic ones. The U.S. has not yet committed, and the all-important principle of collective defense, an attack on one is an attack on all, is not explicitly included. Still, the proposal signals a readiness from Europe that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. The mention of a multinational Ukrainian-led coalition and the possibility of direct military intervention in case of renewed aggression are particularly notable. Bitili concludes with a hint of guarded optimism. What matters now is for Trump to sign. Then let him take it to Putin and see what comes next. But while high-level talks continued in Berlin, behind closed doors and flashing cameras, details began to leak. According to the Wall Street Journal,
It was the American side that ultimately broke the negotiation deadlock, offering Ukraine concrete security commitments on the second day of talks. Washington proposed a structure reminiscent of NATO's Article 5, a collective response mechanism should Russia violate peace again. Sources say the discussions even involved General Alexis Grinkevich, NATO's top commander in Europe, a signal of how seriously the alliance is taking this process. President Zelensky publicly praised the guarantees, calling them a step toward real security. He noted that the draft resembles NATO's defense commitments and that progress is visible. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz echoed this sentiment, saying, "What the US has put on the table in Berlin is remarkable, both legally and materially. We will not repeat the mistakes of the Minsk agreements." But the world's attention quickly shifted to Washington once again. Reports suggest Trump was briefed twice on the Berlin negotiations. His reaction was cautious, yet telling. He's open to presenting the guarantees to the Senate, but warned the offer won't stay on the table forever. That statement sent ripples through diplomatic circles. Was it a hint at pressure on Kiev? To move quickly? Perhaps to concede territory? Or just a businessman's tactic to accelerate negotiations? President Zelensky, for his part, remains skeptical. He reminded that haste in diplomacy is rarely a good sign. "If someone's rushing you," he said, "it usually means they want to take advantage." According to diplomatic leaks, negotiators plan to finalize the text of the guarantees within days. After that, US officials may consult with Russian counterparts, an extraordinary step given the context. Over the weekend, there may even be another US-Ukraine working session in Miami, involving military planners and strategists. What's clear is that the talks are moving faster than anyone expected, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Because if this plan succeeds, it could mark the first realistic path to ending the war without surrender. But if it fails, it may instead become another chapter in a long history of broken promises and missed chances. And yet, even as leaders discuss peace, the front lines remain alive with fire and noise. Russia's attempts to regain momentum in Kupiansk have faltered, with mounting losses and collapsing logistics. Reports from both sides suggest the Russian military is under severe strain, while Ukraine maintains its defensive posture. Still, optimism is cautious, and the shadow of uncertainty looms over every announcement. What happens next may determine not only the fate of Ukraine, but the balance of power in Europe for decades. Stay tuned. The story is just beginning to unfold. And if you want to follow every step of it, the deals, the shifts, the truths behind the public statements, make sure you subscribe and stay with us. Because what's coming next may redefine everything we thought we knew about this war. Part 2. In Berlin, as the final night of negotiations dragged past midnight, the atmosphere thickened with cautious hope. Delegates who had arrived with tired cynicism now found themselves standing before what could be a turning point in the European security order. For months, the word guarantees had been tossed around like a political slogan, but in those rooms, it started to take shape. The American delegation, initially hesitant, had brought forward a proposal that gave the European leaders a real foundation to rally around. Sources close to the talks described how the U.S. team suggested a system of conditional commitments, military, logistical, and financial, that would activate automatically in case of renewed Russian aggression. It wasn't NATO's Article 5, but it was the closest thing yet. President Zelensky, looking visibly exhausted but focused, addressed the press that night with a measured tone. "We have seen a real draft. It's not words anymore. It's a document." His remarks came just after the U.S. confirmed that the proposal would be coordinated directly through NATO structures, though still outside formal membership. It was a balancing act between strategic caution and moral clarity. For Kiev, even the shadow of NATO protection was better than standing alone. For Europe, this was a test of its unity. Yet, the optimism in Berlin was quickly tempered by new reports from Washington. Donald Trump's advisors confirmed that he had been briefed twice about the emerging framework, and while he didn't reject it outright, he was far from enthusiastic. "We'll look at it carefully," he told reporters at Mar-a-Lago. "But I don't like bad deals, and I don't want the US to carry the whole burden." Those words instantly echoed through global markets and diplomatic circles. Trump's tone suggested he viewed the proposal through the lens of cost and benefit, not alliance and principle. Within hours, major networks in Europe led with headlines: "Trump hesitant on Ukraine pact," "Future of security deal in limbo," "Europe moves forward without Washington." Behind the scenes, however, US officials were trying to keep the momentum alive. The Pentagon quietly confirmed that NATO's European Command, led by General Alexis Grinkovich, was already analyzing possible logistics routes for rapid support to Ukraine in case of escalation. It was a sign that the military component of the guarantees was being treated seriously.
German Chancellor Merz praised the progress, telling reporters, "For the first time, we see the architecture of peace emerging, not as a dream, but as a structure." French President Emmanuel Macron echoed the sentiment, emphasizing that Europe must take responsibility for its own continent. But even as words of unity filled press conferences, the war continued to write its own grim headlines. In the early hours of the morning, explosions were heard in Novorossiysk. Ukrainian drones had struck again, this time reportedly hitting a Russian submarine docked in the bay. The submarine, a Varshavyanka-class vessel armed with Caliber cruise missiles, was one of the few remaining assets capable of launching deep strikes into Ukrainian territory. According to preliminary intelligence, it suffered critical damage. The SBU later confirmed that this was the first successful underwater drone strike on a submarine in military history. The weapon, known as Sushi Baby, had been developed specifically for this type of mission, a sleek, compact drone capable of operating autonomously at significant depths. It approached undetected, detonating under the hull. The Russian side initially denied any losses, yet within hours, local authorities in Krasnodar reported emergency crews responding to a maritime incident. Even pro-Russian bloggers admitted the seriousness of the attack. "There are many questions for the Black Sea Fleet Command," wrote one of them. "No protection system worked. If this continues, the fleet will cease to exist." Indeed, the psychological effect was immense. The image of an invulnerable Russian navy, already shaken by previous strikes in Sevastopol, had just taken another blow. At the same time, flames rose from oil terminals and refineries across southern Russia. Ukrainian drones had hit targets in the Caspian region for the third time in as many days. One of the attacks damaged equipment at the Korchagin oil field, operated by Lukoil, forcing production to halt. The Aksarayski gas processing plant in Astrakhan was also hit, sparking a massive fire visible for miles. Ukrainian military sources later said the strike was aimed at reducing Russia's capacity to produce explosive-grade sulfur used in ammunition. The scale of these operations suggested an increasingly sophisticated campaign, one designed not only to weaken Russia's war economy, but to show that no target was beyond reach. Meanwhile, the humanitarian situation in eastern Ukraine remained tense. Russian forces continued attempts to advance near Kupiansk, but even pro-war Russian bloggers conceded that the situation was catastrophic. Supplies were collapsing, morale was plummeting, and reports emerged of units suffering near-total losses. A soldier from the 589th Rifle Regiment posted a desperate video describing how his entire company was wiped out in Pokrovsk. His words, halting, trembling, painted a portrait of disarray. Commanders, he claimed, had sent troops across minefields without reconnaissance. Those who tried to retreat were threatened or beaten. His footage, later verified, became one of the most discussed materials of the week, illustrating the internal rot of the Russian military structure. Independent analysis from the platform Deep State
revealed that since the full-scale invasion began, Russian forces had captured only 23% of Donetsk region, while Ukraine still held 22.6%. The rate of occupation had slowed to a crawl. Based on current progress, analysts estimated it would take Russia another 3 years to occupy the rest of the Donetsk Oblast, assuming no major counteroffensives. The comparison with historical military campaigns was striking. Nazi Germany had marched from the Bug River to Stalingrad and back to Berlin in less than 4 years. Russia's army had advanced from Donetsk to Pokrovsk in almost the same time. The conclusion was clear. The so-called Second Army of the World was now moving at a glacial pace, paying an unbearable human cost for minimal territorial gain. Still, numbers and maps cannot capture the full tragedy. In small Russian towns, mothers continue to bury their sons. In Vyazma, Smolensk region, a mother named Tatiana described to local journalists how new sections had to be added to the cemetery because the old one could no longer hold the dead from the special operation. Her son, Pavel Polyakov, was only 22. Before his death, he told her that his army pay felt like bloody money. He refused to save it, giving most away to friends. He understood what it meant, she said. He knew what he was part of. Her story, one among thousands, quietly echoed through Russian social networks before censors took it down. And corruption within the system only deepens the despair. In Bryansk region, a local deputy from United Russia, Vladimir Reuk, was sentenced to 10 years in prison for defrauding soldiers who hoped to avoid further deployment. He took their money, promising to help them get out of the front lines, though he had no power to do so. When one of the victims refused to pay, Reuk tried to extort him again, this time for a fake medal. It wasn't his first conviction. He had already served 8 years for similar schemes. Even in war, Russia's culture of exploitation thrives. As this grim picture unfolds, European analysts warn that Putin's regime faces a dangerous convergence of military exhaustion and domestic instability. The economy, under pressure from sanctions, struggles to sustain the war's costs. The latest EU sanctions target shipping companies linked to Russia's shadow fleet that transports sanctioned oil using deceptive routes through the UAE, Vietnam, and other intermediaries. The goal is to close the last loopholes that allow Rosneft and Lukoil to sell crude under false flags. European officials hope Washington will soon mirror these measures to prevent the system from collapsing under asymmetric enforcement. But beyond sanctions and strikes, a deeper question hangs in the air. Is there still room for diplomacy? The White House insists the Berlin process is about deterrence, not peace talks. Yet sources in Kiev say the US has quietly opened channels to Moscow through intermediaries. The idea, one official explained, is to make sure Russia understands the consequences before the final signing of the guarantees. It's a delicate dance, balancing firmness with flexibility. Meanwhile, the war of perception continues. A new poll by the Kiev International Institute of Sociology found that 72% of Ukrainians would support a peace plan freezing the current front lines, provided Ukraine receives reliable security guarantees. Only 9% expect the war to end before 2026. Despite hardship, 63% say they're ready to endure as long as needed. In contrast, trust in the United States and NATO has slightly declined, while trust in Europe remains stable. Analysts attribute this to Trump's rhetoric, which many Ukrainians view as dismissive. Interestingly, President Zelensky's approval has risen again to 61%, showing that attacks on him from abroad only strengthen his domestic legitimacy. Against this backdrop, the Ukrainian government continues to mobilize society not only for resistance, but for resilience. In Dnipropetrovsk region, a major fundraiser for electric generators was launched to help civilians survive Russian strikes on the energy grid. Volunteers highlight that these are not military funds. They're about keeping hospitals, schools, and shelters running. The campaign, managed through trusted channels, raised thousands within days. The message is clear. Ukraine's ability to endure depends not only on weapons, but on the will of its people. And as Europe debates guarantees and Washington hesitates, Ukraine keeps fighting, adapting, surviving. On the ground, in the air, and now beneath the sea. The war has entered a new phase, one defined by innovation, attrition, and psychology. The drone that hit the submarine in Novorossiysk was not just a weapon, it was a message that even the deepest waters offer no safety anymore. Stay with us. The full story of these negotiations, the shifting balance on the front, and the silent struggles inside Russia will continue in the next part. What's coming could reshape everything, the course of the war, the stability of Europe, and perhaps even the meaning of peace itself. Part 3. The unfolding reality of the war has moved far beyond simple maps and numbers. What began as a regional conflict now reaches into the very core of global politics, affecting alliances, economies, and the perception of power itself.
The events of the past week, negotiations in Berlin, attacks at sea, and shifts in the energy war have exposed how much the balance of the world now depends on Ukraine's endurance and on whether the West has the will to match its promises with action. Beneath every official statement lies a deeper question. Can democracies hold together long enough to secure peace, or will fatigue and political rivalry fracture their resolve just when unity is needed most? In Kiev, the mood is both weary and defiant. President Volodymyr Zelensky has spent much of December coordinating with allies, preparing for the next phase of talks with the United States. According to officials, the potential Miami meeting between Ukrainian and American delegations could finalize the framework of the new security pact. It would involve joint defense centers, real-time intelligence exchange, and pre-positioned weapon stockpiles on Ukrainian soil, managed by a multinational staff. Such measures would effectively integrate Ukraine into the Western defense ecosystem even before formal NATO membership. Yet diplomats warn that the plan remains fragile. Any change in the U.S. political climate could undo months of work. The ghost of uncertainty hovers over every step. Donald Trump's latest remarks have only added to that uncertainty. Speaking during an interview in Florida, he declared that peace is possible, but only if all sides make serious compromises. When pressed to define those compromises, he avoided specifics, repeating that the war never should have started. In Europe, analysts interpreted this as a sign that Trump remains reluctant to commit to long-term support for Ukraine. German media pointed out that the former president's phrasing, all sides, implicitly equates aggressor and victim, something European leaders have tried to avoid since day one. Nevertheless, Trump's potential return to power remains the largest variable in the equation. If he refuses to endorse the guarantees, Europe may find itself facing Russia largely alone. Meanwhile, the military situation continues to shift in unpredictable ways. Ukrainian intelligence reports that Russia has intensified drone and missile strikes targeting power plants and substations. The Washington Post, citing energy experts, confirmed that nearly 5,000 drones and rockets were launched in November alone, more than double the number earlier this year. The goal appears to be the fragmentation of Ukraine's energy grid into isolated regions, making restoration and coordination increasingly difficult. Major cities such as Kharkiv, Dnipro, and Kiev are operating under rolling blackouts. Yet local communities have adapted quickly. Generators hum in courtyards, volunteers distribute power banks and heaters, and public morale, despite exhaustion, remains surprisingly firm. For every blackout, social media fills with stories of resilience, neighbors sharing electricity, schools reopening underground, medics working under candlelight. Across the border,
the consequences of Ukraine's strikes are equally visible. Satellite images show continuing fires at the Astrakhan gas processing plant, with production halted for at least a week. Analysts from Jane's Defense Review note that such facilities are not easily repaired under sanctions. Replacement parts for compressors and turbines are now nearly impossible to import. In the long term, these disruptions will hit Russia's capacity to produce critical materials for ammunition and explosives. Combined with the EU's new sanctions against shadow tanker operators, Moscow faces an increasingly narrow corridor for exporting oil. Western officials believe this is part of a strategy to squeeze the Kremlin financially while avoiding direct confrontation. Still, Russia continues to find new routes through intermediary countries, prolonging the economic standoff. Inside Russia, cracks are becoming harder to conceal. Independent media from the regions report growing discontent among conscripts' families, who accuse the defense ministry of withholding payments and falsifying casualty lists.
Local administrations, overwhelmed by the number of funerals, have opened new burial sections dedicated exclusively to those killed in the special operation. In towns like Bryansk, Kursk, and Smolensk, photographs show endless rows of identical wooden crosses, each marked only by a laminated photo and a date. Officials try to keep ceremonies quiet, but videos from cemeteries regularly leak online, revealing a scale of loss that state media never mentions. The testimonies of mothers like Tatiana Polyakova resonate deeply because they strip away propaganda and expose the human cost behind the official rhetoric of patriotism and honor. The internal corruption that feeds on this chaos continues unchecked. Reports have surfaced of recruiters forcing conscripts to sign contracts under threats or physical abuse. A former fighter from the Chechen Akhmat units in Belgorod told journalists that soldiers who refused to extend their service were beaten and detained. He described cases of commanders using drones to destroy small local shops in retaliation for selling alcohol. A punishment strike, he called it. These stories reveal not just moral decay, but the breakdown of discipline within parts of the Russian military. The army that once promised swift victory now appears trapped in a cycle of violence, fear, and deception, where even its own soldiers become victims. On the Ukrainian side, the war has entered a stage of strategic patience.
Military analysts at the Institute for the Study of War emphasize that Ukraine's recent drone operations in the Black and Caspian Seas demonstrate a shift toward the asymmetric warfare, precision, intelligence-driven, and psychological. The destruction of the Warszawianka-class submarine in Novorossiysk sent a signal not only to the Russian Navy, but to global observers. The technological balance is changing. With Western components, domestic innovation, and tactical adaptability, Ukraine has turned limited resources into an effective deterrent. Russian naval bloggers acknowledge that the Black Sea Fleet can no longer operate freely. Some ships have been relocated deeper into the port or to other bases, a rare admission of vulnerability. As this naval shadow war unfolds, attention also turns to the front lines in Donetsk and Luhansk. Despite heavy losses, Russia continues to press near Pokrovsk, while Ukrainian units strengthen defenses using mobile artillery and new fortifications. Satellite data shows that Russia's weekly territorial gains remain minimal, around 10 to 15 square kilometers, while casualty estimates rise. The comparison made by Deep State between Russia's sluggish campaign and the speed of historical world wars circulates widely among military observers. The numbers are cold, but their implication is profound. A modern authoritarian power is exhausting itself in a conflict it cannot decisively win, while a smaller nation, supported by democracies, defies collapse.
Back in Europe, the political aftershocks of Berlin's announcement continue. Newspapers in Paris, Warsaw, and London run editorials underlining the significance of the joint statement. For the first time, the European Union has outlined a long-term commitment to Ukraine's defense that goes beyond emergency aid. Critics argue that without American participation, the guarantees lack enforcement power.
Supporters counter that Europe must finally learn to act independently. In Brussels, discussions are underway about creating a permanent European defense fund, an idea that once seemed impossible. Diplomats describe it as a turning point in post-war Europe, one that could redefine the continent's security identity. Public opinion reflects this transformation. Polls across Germany, France, and Poland show a majority supporting continued aid to Ukraine, though enthusiasm varies. In Germany, fatigue grows over energy costs and inflation, yet trust in the government's stance on Ukraine remains stable. In France, Macron faces pressure from both left and right, but continues to frame the issue as a fight for the future of Europe. In Poland, new leadership under Donald Tusk has reaffirmed that Ukraine's defense is the defense of our own borders. Across Europe, the language of solidarity has shifted from moral duty to strategic necessity. And yet, the emotional dimension of this war persists.
Each new Ukrainian attack, each blackout in Kiev, each diplomatic statement from Berlin or Washington carries the weight of human endurance. The story is not just about geopolitics, it's about survival. In Dnipropetrovsk, volunteers continue raising funds for generators, their campaign now supported by musicians, journalists, and ordinary citizens. Videos show children thanking donors from dark basements, hospitals illuminated by single lamps powered through crowd-funded batteries. These scenes reveal the real face of resilience, the part of the war that no treaty can capture. Looking ahead, the coming weeks could prove decisive. If the Miami talks go ahead and Washington signs on to the European framework, the world may witness the birth of a new kind of alliance, one not born of victory, but of shared endurance. If the talks fail, the consequences could be grave. Russia would interpret hesitation as weakness, while Ukraine would face its hardest winter yet, with uncertainty hanging over its allies. Every actor knows this, which is why diplomacy now feels as tense as the front line. The coming months will test everything: Europe's unity, America's reliability, Ukraine's strength, and Russia's ability to sustain its war machine. The outcome will not be decided by a single battle or speech, but by persistence.
From Berlin's polished halls to the freezing trenches near Kupiansk, from the corridors of the White House to the burning platforms of the Caspian Sea, this war has become a mirror reflecting the character of nations. The choices made